the Heart Failure Collaboratory Heart of the Matter podcast. I'm Chris O'Connor, and we're going to be discussing site-based research. What are the best practices? And we've had some recent opportunities to recognize site-based researchers of distinction at the American Heart Association. And we've also been talking about this topic for a while because we recognize that it's so important to get this right. And I'm here with my distinguished colleagues. I'll ask them to introduce themselves. Marshall?
Hi, Marshall Brinkley, Associate Professor of Medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville. I'm honored to be here. I co-direct our site-based research in heart failure.
Thank you, Marshall. Jana?
Jana Svetlichnaya. I'm a heart failure cardiologist at Kaiser Permanente in Northern California, San Francisco, where I serve as the PI for multiple clinical trials.
Thank you for joining us, Jana, your first time. And Anu, who's a regular.
Thank you for having me back. I'm Anu Lala. I'm a heart function cardiologist at Mount Sinai in New York, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Well, this is, today we're looking at almost a crisis in site-based research, I think, in cardiology and particularly in heart failure. If you look at the last 30 years, we've seen a progressive decrease in our performance to recruit patients in heart failure clinical trials. 30 years ago, about one patient per site per month. Today, 0.4 patients per site per month, a 50% reduction in our performance, our ability to recruit patients. You contrast the percent of patients enrolled in clinical trials who come through our clinics. We see 200,000 clinic visits, through these large health systems, probably much larger in the Kaiser system. And less than 1% of patients with cardiovascular disease are enrolled in clinical trials. That's in contrast to pediatric oncology, where they enroll 70% of the patients who come through a pediatric cancer clinic into clinical trials. And so lots of barriers here on the cardiology side, but opportunities. And Marshall led a very important survey of sites and what were the barriers, what were the sort of places where there were opportunities for people that hit roadblocks in conducting site-based research. And Marshall, before we get into the details around the table here, give us a brief description of your survey and your findings.
Absolutely. So Joanne Lindenfeld and I surveyed 34 sites across the U.S. that represented each of the major geographic regions of the U.S., both academic, majority academic, but also private groups and a few public Veterans Affairs facilities. And so I had a good representation, I think. We asked respondents to identify barriers for site-based research and to rank those barriers on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the most important. And we asked about several different domains. So respondents ranked the greatest barrier to startup was contracting. About 35% said that was the top barrier to startup for studies, followed by staffing shortages. In terms of enrollment, respondents had 56% rated that identifying appropriate patients was the greatest barrier to enrollment in site-based research, followed by competing trials at 24%, number one. As in terms of barriers for investigators, investigator time was ranked the number one barrier. 53% said that was the biggest barrier to research, site-based research. And then finally, in staffing, respondents ranked funding as the number one challenge. 44% said funding was the number one barrier for adequate support staff to conduct site-based research. So I think these findings are not surprising and unfortunately have been issues in the past, but certainly we hope to change those. And the Heart Failure Collaboratory, that's clearly your mission.
Well, terrific summary. And what we hear here is that there's multiple domains where there are barriers. And, I want to get into details of some of these findings, but let's turn to Jana. And Jana was recognized as one of the leading national site-based investigators recently at the 2025 American Heart Association meeting, and it's important. The collaboratory felt it was important to recognize the people on the front line who do excel in site-based research with national recognition, because when you conduct a clinical trial, and old enough to have done a lot of them, let's say you have 100 sites, only about 10 of them are really performing at a really high level. There's 80, kind of performing in the middle, and 10 or more performing, at a level that you almost have to ask them to stop and come out of that trial. So we have to do better. And Jana, describe for us, based on what you heard from Marshall, why is your site successful in conducting site-based research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that a lot of our success really comes from teamwork and also building deliberate systems. When I started, I recognized that it was really important to build strong referral pathways with hospital-based specialists and AFM who are, really on the front lines of taking care of a lot of these patients. Specifically, a lot of the trials that I've done have been in HFpEF, and at least within Kaiser, patients with HFpEF typically are not seen in cardiology, are not followed by the inpatient cardiology service. So trying to enroll these patients in clinical trials came with the lesson that I would have to do a lot of medical center wide education, give a lot of talks, make a lot of friends, get the internal medicine residents excited about the possibility of offering a potential enrollment in the clinical trial as one of the options for every single patient admitted with HFpEF. So it gives me great joy now to get a chart chat at all hours of the day and night from
Mhm.
a resident who's admitting a patient and says, hey, this patient is not yet on Jardiance, not yet on spironolactone. They could be a candidate for one of your studies. Can you come and see them? I think that's really one of the keys to success is just getting that kind of teamwork, the strong referral pathways, and then also really, deliberately, proactively screening every hospital admission, not just looking for, heart failure as the diagnosis, but also looking things like volume overload, diastolic dysfunction, just looking at the BNP. So trying to make sure that you have a wide base. I think that's really been the success too, trying to find these patients because they are out there, but finding them sometimes can be challenging.
You're exactly right. The patients are there, and we know that patients in clinical trials, even when they receive placebo, have good outcomes, have good care. They get really we built our disease management program when I was at Duke off the basis of site-based research because they get such good care from the study coordinators. But what I heard was communication, teamwork, and a highly engaged PI. That's what I heard. Anu, you've been doing this now and supervising this at Sinai for a while. Tell us your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. O'Connor. Yana, you make me want to move to California more than I already did. I think at Sinai we've seen variability in terms of enrollment, and I think it depends on the patient population, and then the barriers for that particular patient population may not be the same as for another population. A half-path population may not be the same as an advanced heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. I think there are barriers for staff and research team that then can those are more equitably kind of spread out, and then they're a little more agnostic to the type of the trial. And then there's the barriers for investigators. And Chris, you've done such a nice job through the collaboratory and I think individually of really advocating for recognition for research-based efforts as a faculty member of your under you. And I think when it comes, it's interesting for us, we've been seeing, for example, a very high uptake in enrollment for trials that target very advanced populations. Whereas we're not so much seeing that same enthusiasm for enrollment for Like say, Yana, maybe I can take some tips from you on a HFpEF population that might have been recently hospitalized. The funny thing is that, and we struggle with this in our community more broadly, is we don't know where those thresholds are. What is advanced? What's not? And yet we know that a person, even with heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, who's been hospitalized is at incredibly high risk for rehospitalization, mortality, comorbid disease complications, et cetera. And so I feel like there's such a need for this cultural shift to take place to really emphasize the need for clinical trials to improve care across the board, whether you're in placebo arm or the active treatment arm. And that I think is something I pray that we're getting better at as a community, but I think we still have opportunities to get even better at.
Really well said, and so much opportunity, like you said. It's so interesting. We see the same thing at Inova. HFpEF very hard. Not always in the cardiology clinics, right? You see them in primary care. You see it in hospice on the inpatient side. But amyloid, it's in an amyloid clinic. You can collect them all there, and people seem to enroll relatively well in the amyloid trial. So, Marshall, what's it look like at Vanderbilt?
Yes, I think some of the barriers recently have been honestly changes in staffing based on the recent policy changes with federal effort. We've seen some RAFs among administrative staff, and some of those staff, besides supporting federally funded research, also support industry funded research. And so that's been a challenge because staff are being asked to do more with less. There's been some staff turnover, and that makes it challenging when you need to get positions approved to rehire, and it's easy to get behind. So that's one of the challenges. I do think there is support for investigator time from the institution, which is great in terms of that academic component, but still clinical pressures are real, especially in the current environment.
The economic pressure on health systems and the academic medical centers. So the protected time was off the margins of health systems. That margin has narrowed significantly post COVID. We've seen all these things that happen due to labor, due to supply, due to now the Medicaid cuts. And so that pressure now, there's no dollars aren't there for the protected time. And that's why we heard Marshall has articulated and others have, at Vanderbilt, the amount of protected time is being reduced. And so, and everywhere it is. What can we do? I mean, the one area that we've worked on hard, and I think all of us should do, is philanthropy. People still are out there who want to give back, grateful patients, and giving back to site-based research infrastructure is a really good place for philanthropic dollars. So that's one of our strategies at Inova. But as we go forward and we say, okay, to our audience here, what is the one or two things you could tell them? They're struggling. They're trying to get their site-based research going. It's not going well. Yana, what would you tell them to invest in, to do, to make them be able to stand on the podium one day at the American Heart Association like you did?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just really goes back to engagement, and it's, engaging the patients, really speaking to them, directly. I always go to the bedside. I'm the first member of the research team to meet the patient. I think you have to kind of own it, to say, to really, tell the patient you can be part of this, great scientific effort, to help improve the care of heart failure patients, for such a long time. And I think that actually motivates a lot of patients. I think it's also about engaging the community. So, your hospitals-based specialists, multi-specialty engagement, as I've alluded to. And finally, I think it's really engaging the research team. And I think Marshall made a great point. Times are hard. There's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of pressure on kind of every member of the team. So, I think a lot of the success that I've had is really just making sure that, every single member of the team feels recognized and feels appreciated for their efforts. So just last week, on New Year's Eve, we were able to randomize 2 patients, and, my research nurse, like, stayed overtime, and the first thing I did was to go to the Teams channel that we all share and just, put in a lot of recognition for her, for her efforts, and I really made the success, in huge part about her because it really was, and I think just kind of, even, like, day-to-day recognition of their efforts and the time that they spent helping us is just really, really key. So I think recognizing every single member of the team, making sure that they're practicing at the top of their license, and making sure that they're invested in the project is has been one of the key to to my success.
Really nice comments, Yana. Anu, what one or two points would you give our collective audience?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think if I had to sum it down to two, partially this is what we've had success with, but partially it's also pie in the sky hopes and dreams. So one would be, I think when one is diagnosed with cancer, there's a generalized expectation that they will be not just offered participation in a clinical trial, but it's a part of their treatment algorithm. And that's a cultural shift. We've started doing things like that. Like while you're in the waiting room, we kind of have people read just a little snippet on what heart failure is. And right up front, say you will be approached to participate in clinical trials. And that is why we have medications and therapies that work for you today. So I think really at the outset, having our patients expect clinical trial participation as a part of their therapeutic pathway is super key. Number two, and this is like a love hate relationship, is I think leveraging our EHR systems is, and I know everyone talks about this and everybody says they want to use AI and make it, more efficient, et cetera. My personal experience is there's tremendous promise, but I feel like we haven't maximized our potential. And my greatest hope is that we will. I would love to be able to put in clinical trial entry criteria and exclusion criteria into the EHR, have a list that can be further refined to really cut out the amount of human effort that needs to go into the screening process to streamline things and make it more efficient. I think we've made progress, but we're not quite there. So those would be my two aspirational ideas that have some foundation in having been helpful for us at Sinai.
Well, you're exactly right. Technology, we have to get technology to assist in this. It's obviously we're accelerating it in the clinical practice very hard, and we're seeing gains there. We've got to be able to do that also in our research infrastructure. Marshall, one or two points for our investigators listening today that can make them move the needle on their performance.
I certainly agree with everything that Yana and Anu have said about enthusiasm and leadership from investigators. I would add to that being available and responsive to the coordinators. They have a hard job, and answering their emails and queries and phone calls and just being available, I think goes a long way in just developing so that they feel appreciated for the work that they do. Two, as Yana indicated, it would also echo just personally calling or visiting patients in the hospital to discuss it. Seeing that when I do that personally, it's a lot more likely that the patient is going to be agreeable to participate than if, a coordinator or someone else approaches them or they get a electronic message.
That engagement of the PI is so critical, and you're exactly right in that you need to have that connectivity, that trust with the patient, so that they recognize that they're going into an experimental study, and they have that trust of their provider or the physician that's coordinating that study. Well, this has been a terrific conversation. It's a conversation that will not stop. We're committed to, in the collaboratory, to bending the curve on this important challenge. But for today, I want to thank you and thank our audience for joining us at the Heart Failure Collaboratory Heart of the Matter. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.